What I'm actually wanting to talk about is the amount of segregation that exists between all of these different communities that we have in the world, not only of autism, but neurodiversity in general. We have all these different neurotypes, autism and ADHD and others. We have patterns where they co-occur together, like autism and intellectual disability together. We have different age groups, and there's just heterogeneity between all even within all of these categories. And then we have our other communities associated with all of this, our communities of parents, our communities of researchers, our communities of professionals, and of course further subgroups within each of these areas. And what people like Christina are up to is really an exception that proves the general rule that ordinarily there is just so little contact between these communities. I used to think before I got involved in research that all of these debates between these communities were like some giant brawl where everybody is constantly fighting one another and kicking and punching in this horrific mess. And then as I started to move out of my community of autistic adults into this research community, and then from there into other communities as well, I started to realize just how little contact there is, how really what people are saying and doing in one community is just going completely past these other communities because of this segregation, so that really we're all just in our own little echo chambers, effectively. And so as a result of all that, we have these very large differences in the substance of our opinions on these issues, and even beyond those big substantive differences, we also have differences in the language and the rhetoric that we use. Like, for example, if we're using terms like risk and rescue and disorder and deficit and so on and so forth in a research talk, then even above and beyond technical and incomprehensible jargon, that is going to make that talk really off-putting, if not offensive, to a lot of people who then will not be engaging with the subject material. And a lot of these controversies come back to this whole neurodiversity paradigm, and more particularly its scope. Is this something that we can apply to some autistic people but not all, to all autistic people, all neurodivergent people, or no neurodivergent people at all? One example of an opinion on this comes from these researchers who are using level of functioning terminology, but basically they're talking about people with intellectual disabilities or without intellectual disabilities, autistics with and without intellectual disabilities, and they're saying that neurodiversity should really only be applied to these autistic people without intellectual disabilities. And they say this because according to them, the neurodiversity paradigm is the idea that people do not need care, they do not need supports, and that they do not have a disability. We can get a very different view if we look here at this autistic advocate who wrote an essay saying actually the neurodiversity paradigm is not inconsistent at all with the idea of disability, and in fact we do recognize that autistic advocates that people are in fact disabled. And it's interesting to me that we have all of these disagreements because if we think about something else like the social model of disability that's come up in some of the other talks, this is a much clearer idea. It comes out of the physical disability world. It's the idea that disability is caused by stuff out in the environment, not people themselves. So the classic example would be like the stairs cause a disability, the wheelchair ramp acts as an accommodation there. The social model is very clear. It's what entered discourse precisely defined. The neurodiversity paradigm is not clear. Judy Singer coined the term, and she wrote a very interesting and subtle honors thesis that really only became widely publicly available as a Kindle book a few years ago. Until then, really the neurodiversity paradigm entered discourse through things like this. This article in The Atlantic by Harvey Bloom, which mentions the word neurodiversity in exactly one sentence. So what exactly does that mean? It's pretty vague, and it gives a lot of license for people to interpret it as they see fit. So that means there's a lot of different ideas about what the neurodiversity paradigm exactly means, what are its tenets, what, that creates the potential for people on one side of the debate or the other to pick a definition that suits their purposes. Like if they are pro-neurodiversity, pick a sensible definition of neurodiversity and a radical, wild, and crazy definition of the competing pathology idea. And really this is in addition to those problems that I mentioned earlier with the segregation of these communities, creating a further situation of incommensurability, that we just don't have a common standard of measurement to weight these ideas against one another. This is the idea from philosophy of science, where you have two world systems and they're so different in their assumptions and jargon and language that you just can't find some common thing to compare them. And I think that we're in an even worse situation in the neurodiversity world. And then, of course, there's this other thing that is really making this a complex debate, that is the question, does this apply only to some neurodivergent people or all or none? Is it different based on all these heterogeneities? And some advocates have responded to this by saying, well, really all autistic people are similar in some fundamental way. But that's not too convincing to me, because I know that there's a lot of autistic people and some of them are extremely different from me. So I think that if it is in fact the case that neurodiversity applies to everyone, that's something that we have to demonstrate. That's not something we can assert. So we unfortunately have the difficulty there that there is no sort of neurodiversity definition that has all these tenets clearly laid out, but what we maybe can do is look at some ideas that are clearly associated with the neurodiversity paradigm or the pathology paradigm and say, do these make sense and applied broadly or just narrowly?